In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where 1,000 alien civilizations consider themselves the apex of evolution, there exists a dangerous misconception about a small blue planet in an unremarkable star system. They see humans as soft, pink creatures who cry over spilled drinks and faint at the sight of blood. They observe our tendency to help the wounded, our hesitation before violence, our complex emotions, and they mistake these traits for weakness. What they don't understand is that humanity's greatest strength isn't our technology, our intelligence, or our numbers. It's our ability to surprise them when they least expect it. It's the quiet fury that builds behind kind eyes, the steel resolve hidden beneath gentle words, and the explosive power that emerges when someone pushes too far. This is the story of Dr. Sarah Chun, a xenobiologist whose life's work was understanding alien species, who found herself face-to-face with a creature that understood only one language: violence. It's the story of what happens when a being from the stars mistakes human compassion for human capability and learns too late that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one that doesn't look like a predator at all. In the interstellar arena of the Galactic Research Station Kepler 442b, where beings from across the cosmos gather to share knowledge, one alien made a fatal error in judgment. He thought he was dealing with prey. He was wrong. The observation deck of Research Station Kepler 442b stretched across 300 meters of reinforced transparent aluminum, offering a breathtaking view of the gas giant's swirling storms below. Dr. Sarah Chun pressed her palm against the cool surface, watching lightning dance between crimson clouds that could swallow Earth's moonhole. After 18 months aboard the station, the view still took her breath away. Another sleepless night, Dr. Chun? The voice belonged to Kextar, a reptilian Zalani whose scales shifted from deep blue to concerned purple as he approached. His 4 arms carried a steaming cup of what passed for coffee in this corner of the galaxy. Sarah accepted the drink gratefully, inhaling the familiar bitter aroma. The neural mapping data from the Arcturus samples isn't making sense. I've run the analysis 16 times, and I keep getting the same impossible results. Kextar's head tilted, a gesture that somehow translated across species as curiosity. Impossible how? The synaptic patterns suggest cognitive abilities that shouldn't exist in a non-sentient species. But according to every other metric we have, these creatures barely qualify as complex multicellular organisms. Sarah rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of months of research pressing down on her. Either our understanding of neural development is fundamentally flawed, or we're missing something crucial about how consciousness emerges. The Zalani scales flickered through several colors before settling on a warm gold that Sarah had learned indicated deep thought. Perhaps the answer lies not in what you're seeing, but in what you're not seeing. Before Sarah could respond, the observation deck's atmosphere shifted. The gentle hum of conversation died, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that made her skin crawl. She turned to see a figure that dominated the space despite being only slightly taller than an average human. Vrak the Destroyer stood in the doorway like a monument to violence. His species, the Korthagi, had earned their fearsome reputation across 3 galactic quadrants through sheer brutality. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, his exoskeleton gleamed like polished obsidian under the deck's soft lighting. For arms, each ending in claws that could shred titanium, hung loose at his sides. But it was his eyes that drew the most attention, those burning orange orbs that seemed to catalog every living thing as either threat or prey. The human scientist, Vraktich's voice rumbled like distant thunder as his gaze fixed on Sarah. I have heard much about your species' supposed intelligence. Sarah felt Kextar's protective instincts flare, his scales shifting to warning reds and blacks, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm. I am Dr. Sarachen. You must be Vraktich. Your reputation precedes you. The Korthagi's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. As does yours, human. They say you seek to understand the minds of lesser creatures. A fitting pursuit for a lesser creature herself. The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Around them, Other researchers slowly moved away, recognizing the predatory undertones in the warrior's posture. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, waiting to see how the small human would respond to such obvious provocation. Understanding others has always been humanity's greatest strength, Sarah replied calmly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. It's what allows us to find common ground, even with those who might initially seem incompatible. Vrakth's laugh was like breaking glass. Common ground? There is no common ground between predator and prey, human. Your species achieved spaceflight through luck and the charity of others. You lack the strength, the killer instinct, the will to do what must be done when survival is at stake. Sarah sipped her coffee, using the moment to study her antagonist. She recognized the type immediately from her xenobiology training. Apex predator, high aggression, social dominance through intimidation. Classic alpha behavior designed to establish hierarchy through fear. Strength comes in many forms, she said quietly. Sometimes the most powerful force is the one that chooses not to act. Pretty words from a creature too weak to act otherwise. Vrakth stepped closer, and Sarah could smell the metallic tang of his pheromones, chemical signals designed to trigger fear responses in potential prey. Your kind speaks of peace, while others fight for survival. You study life while warriors like myself preserve it. Kekstar scales had gone completely black, a warning sign that even other species recognized. Vrakth, this is a research station. We're here for scientific collaboration, not to relitigate ancient conflicts. The Korthagi's attention snapped to the Zilani like a predator focusing on movement in his peripheral vision. And what would you know of conflict, Scale Singer? Your people perfected the art of surrender long before mine perfected the art of war. That's enough. Sarah's voice cut through the growing tension like a blade. Not louder, but somehow more commanding than before. Kekstar is one of the finest xenobiologists in this sector. His people's understanding of electromagnetic resonance in biological systems is unmatched. If you have issues with his research, present evidence. Otherwise, your opinions are just noise. The observation deck fell completely silent. Even the usual background hum of the station seemed to fade as every being present processed what they had just witnessed. A human, barely 5.5 feet tall, and weighing perhaps 60 kilograms, had just dressed down one of the galaxy's most feared predators. Vrakth's orange eyes blazed brighter, and his claws extended slightly from their sheaths. You dare lecture me, soft skin? You think your words carry weight because you've memorized some fact from your databases? I think my words carry weight because they're backed by observation and evidence, Sarah replied, her tone remaining perfectly level. Two things that seem to be in short supply in your particular approach to problem solving. The Korthagi's posture shifted, muscles coiling beneath his exoskeleton as aggressive pheromones flooded the air. Several smaller species began backing toward the exits, recognizing the chemical precursors to violence that their evolution had taught them to fear. You want evidence, human? Here's evidence. Vrakth's voice dropped to a growl that seemed to vibrate through the deck plating. My people have conquered 17 star systems. We've eliminated 6 species that stood in our path. We've never lost a war, never surrendered, never showed mercy to those too weak to defend themselves. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if he had just recited statistical data rather than a litany of genocide. Impressive resume. And what has all that conquest accomplished? What scientific advances has your species contributed? What art, what literature, what philosophy? What have the Korthagi given the galaxy besides fear? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the assembled researchers found themselves leaning forward despite their fear, suddenly invested in an intellectual duel that had somehow replaced what everyone expected to be a physical confrontation. Vrakth's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation. We have given the galaxy order, peace through strength. The weak serve the strong, as nature intended. Nature intended a lot of things that intelligence has improved upon, Sarah observed. Disease, starvation, living in caves. The question isn't what nature intended, but what we choose to become. Choose. The word came out like a curse. There is no choice in survival, human. There is only strength and weakness, predator and prey. And your species. He gestured dismissively with one clawed hand. Your species chose weakness long ago. Sarah finished her coffee and set the cup aside with deliberate care. When she looked up, something in her eyes had changed. The warmth was still there, but underneath it lay something harder, colder, like steel wrapped in silk. You know what I find fascinating about apex predators? She said conversationally. They're usually only apex predators in their native environment. Change the variables, introduce new factors, and suddenly, the king of the mountain becomes lunch for something he never saw coming. Vractiach's claws extended fully, for gleaming talons on each hand that could gut a battle-armored soldier in seconds. Are you threatening me, soft skin? I'm educating you. Sarah's smile was gentle, almost maternal, about the dangers of incomplete data sets. The Korthagi warrior took another step closer, now near enough that Sarah could see her reflection in his polished exoskeleton. His pheromone output had reached levels that were making several of the smaller species physically ill. I have killed beings 3 times your size with my bear claws, he snarled. I have torn apart battle mechs with nothing but fury and determination. What could a fragile little research scientist possibly teach me about danger? Sarah looked around the observation deck, taking note of the positions of every being present, the distance to each exit, the structural weak points in the transparent aluminum viewing wall. Old habits from a past life that most people assumed she'd never lived. The most dangerous thing in any environment, she said quietly, is the predator you don't recognize as a predator until it's too late. Vractiach's laugh was pure mockery. You? You think you're predator? Look at yourself, human. You're small, weak, fragile. Your skin is soft, your claws are non-existent, your teeth couldn't pierce protein paste. You're prey pretending to be a predator. Maybe. Sarah's voice remained calm, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. To most observers, she still looked like a relaxed scientist enjoying a casual conversation. But Kextar, whose people had survived by recognizing subtle threat displays across dozens of species, suddenly felt his scales shift to alarm patterns. Maybe I'm just prey, Sarah continued. But you know what prey becomes really, really good at, Vractiach? The Korthagi leaned closer, drawn in despite himself by the quiet confidence in her voice. Killing predators. The words were spoken so softly that half the room missed them, but Vractiach heard every syllable. For just a moment, something flickered across his features. Not quite fear, but perhaps the first faint recognition that he might have misread the situation. Then his warrior's pride reasserted itself, and he straightened to his full, imposing height. Brave words from someone who's about to learn the difference between theory and practice. Sarah nodded slowly. Yes, she agreed. Someone certainly is. The tension in the observation deck had reached critical mass when Station Commander Thylexix arrived, her crystalline form refracting the ambient light into rainbow patterns across the walls. As a member of the ethereal collective, she possessed natural authority that transcended species boundaries, and her presence immediately defused the immediate threat of violence. Dr. Chun, warrior of Vractiach, her voice resonated like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Perhaps this discussion would be better continued in a more private setting. Vractiach's burning gaze never left Sarah's face as he considered the suggestion. Around them, the other researchers began to disperse, though many lingered within earshot, unwilling to miss whatever might unfold next. Actually, Commander, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the deck, I think Vractiach was about to share some insights about his people's combat philosophy. It could be valuable for my research into aggression patterns across species. The Korthagi's mandibles clicked in surprise. Instead of backing down or accepting the face-saving exit, the human scientist was doubling down on their confrontation. In his experience, prey animals always chose flight when given the opportunity. My combat philosophy is simple, human, Vractiach growled. Identify the strongest opponent in the room and break them. Everything else becomes manageable after that. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if he had just described a particularly interesting chemical reaction. A dominance-based hierarchy system. It works well in stable environments with clearly defined parameters. She paused, tilting her head slightly. Of course, it tends to fail catastrophically when those parameters change. Parameters don't change in combat, soft skin. There's only who lives and who dies. Really? Sarah's eyebrows rose in genuine curiosity. That's interesting, because human combat doctrine is built around the exact opposite principle. We assume parameters will change constantly and plan accordingly. Kextar, who had been following the exchange with growing alarm, finally found his voice. Sarah, perhaps we should return to the laboratory. The neural mapping data you mentioned earlier. She waved him off gently, never taking her eyes from Vraktich. In a moment, Kex, I'm learning quite a lot about Korthagi tactical thinking. It's fascinating how different species approach the same fundamental challenges. Vraktich's claws scraped against the deck, plating as his hands clenched into fists. You speak of combat as if you understand it, human, as if your species has ever faced a real test of strength. Oh, we've faced a few tests, Sarah replied mildly. Not always successfully, but we've learned from each one. That's what we do best, actually. Learn, adapt, overcome. The warrior's laugh was harsh and grating. Your species learned to hide behind shields and call for help when threatened. You learned to run from superior predators and hope someone stronger would protect you. Sarah's smile remained perfectly pleasant, but something cold flickered in her dark eyes. Is that what you think happened when humanity met its first alien predators? I know what happened, Vraktich snarled. Your people cowered on their little blue planet until the Galactic Council decided you might be useful as servants and translators. You were granted space travel out of pity, not merit. Commander Thylex 6's crystalline form shifted colors, indicating deep discomfort with the direction of the conversation. Perhaps we should review the historical records together. There seems to be some confusion about the circumstances of first contact. No confusion, Sarah said quietly. Just selective memory. She turned her attention fully to Vraktich, and the Korthagi found himself momentarily unsettled by the intensity of her gaze. Tell me, warrior, what do you know about the Hunger Wars? The question seemed to come from nowhere, and several of the lingering observers shifted nervously. The Hunger Wars were ancient history, barely mentioned in most galactic databases, but those who knew the stories remembered them with dread. Vraktich's expression became more guarded. Myths and legends. Stories told to frighten children. Myths. Sarah's voice carried a note of surprise that sounded almost genuine. That's curious, because human historians have quite detailed records of the Devourer's arrival in our system. We documented everything very carefully. A chill seemed to settle over the observation deck as the name was spoken aloud. The Devourers were nightmare fuel for most galactic species, living engines of consumption that had swept through the outer rim territories like a plague. But they had vanished centuries ago, their fate unknown to most civilizations. The Devourers never reached the Sol system, Vraktich said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. They were turned back by the combined fleets of the inner worlds. Sarah shook her head slowly. No, Vraktich, they were turned back by us. The words fell into silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of disbelief that spread throughout the room. Even Kextar, who had worked alongside humans for months, stared at Sarah with newfound uncertainty. Impossible, the Korthagi whispered. Humans didn't even have faster-than-light travel when the Devourers were active. We didn't need it, Sarah replied calmly. They came to us. Commander Thylex 6's form had gone completely transparent, a sign of extreme distress among her people. Dr. Chun, the historical records clearly indicate that human first contact occurred peacefully through diplomatic channels. The sanitized records say that, Sarah agreed. The records that were edited to prevent panic, to maintain the illusion that the galaxy was safe from external threats. But The original reports tell a different story. She began to pace slowly across the deck, her movements casual and unhurried, but Vrakti found his predator instincts tracking her motion with growing unease. The Devourers arrived in our system 47 years before official first contact, Sarah continued. 3 massive bioships, each one the size of a small moon, carrying millions of living weapons bred for one purpose: consumption. They had already stripped 17 systems clean, leaving nothing behind but empty space and radiation. The assembled researchers listened in horrified fascination as she spoke. These were details that didn't appear in any public database, information that had been classified at the highest levels of galactic government. They ignored our primitive radio signals, dismissed our chemical rockets, and began the systematic harvesting of our outer colonies. Mars fell in 6 hours. The Jupiter mining stations lasted barely 3 days. Sarah's voice remained clinical, but something else crept into her tone. Something that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. And then they made a mistake. Vrakti found himself leaning forward despite his better judgment. What mistake? They landed on Earth. Sarah stopped pacing and turned to face the assembled group, and for just a moment, every predator instinct in the room screamed danger. Not from any obvious threat, but from something far more subtle and terrifying. The recognition that they were in the presence of something that had looked into the abyss and emerged victorious. You have to understand, she said conversationally, the Devourers had never encountered significant resistance. They were perfect biological weapons, immune to energy attacks, capable of adapting to any environmental conditions, and utterly without fear or mercy. They had consumed entire civilizations without losing a single unit. She smiled, and the expression was gentle and warm and absolutely terrifying. But they had never fought humans before. Kekstar's scales had gone completely white, a fear response he hadn't experienced since childhood. Sarah, he said carefully, what exactly are you saying? I'm saying that when the Devourers landed in Earth's major population centers, they expected to find prey. Instead, they found something that evolution had spent millions of years perfecting. Not just predators, but persistent hunters. Pack hunters. Tool users who could adapt and improvise faster than any biological weapon could evolve. The observation deck had gone completely silent except for the soft hum of life support systems. Even the background chatter from the corridors beyond seemed muted, as if the station itself was holding its breath. The war lasted 18 months, Sarah continued. Not because we couldn't kill them, but because we needed time to study them first. To understand their weaknesses, their behavioral patterns, their breeding cycles. We needed to make sure that when we struck decisively. Vraktich's orange eyes had dimmed to a dull amber, and his claws had retracted unconsciously. The official records say the Devourers simply disappeared. They did disappear, Sarah agreed. Every last one of them, along with their bioships, their support structures, and their entire reproductive infrastructure. We didn't just defeat them, Vraktich. We made them extinct. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Extinction wasn't just defeat in war. It was the complete erasure of a species from the universe. It was something that happened to prey animals, not to apex predators with millions of years of evolutionary perfection behind them. Impossible, Vraktiech repeated, but his voice was barely a whisper now. No single species could achieve that level of destruction. Not against the Devourers. You're right, Sarah nodded. No single species could. But humanity has never been a single species. We're a collection of tribes, nations, cultures, and ideologies that can barely agree on what to have for breakfast. Except when something threatens the survival of our children. She moved closer to the viewing window, gazing out at the swirling storms of the gas giant below. That's when we become something else entirely. Something that makes the Devourers look like an annoyance rather than an existential threat. We become what every other predator in the galaxy fears most. A unified human race with a clear enemy and nothing left to lose. The truth of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket, smothering conversation and leaving everyone present to contemplate the implications. If the gentle, peaceful humans who serve as translators and researchers and diplomats were capable of committing genocide against the galaxy's most feared predators, what did that say about their true nature? So you see, Vrak-Th, Sarah said, turning back to face the now subdued Korthagi warrior. When you call my species weak, when you mock our compassion and our reluctance to use violence, you're misunderstanding what you're looking at. She took a step closer to him, and for the first time in his adult life, the mighty warrior felt the primal urge to step backward. We're not weak. We're restrained. There's a difference. The revelation about the Hunger Wars had shifted the entire dynamic on the observation deck. Conversations that had been building toward violence now carried the undercurrent of something far more complex and dangerous. Vrak-Th, who had entered the room as an apex predator asserting his dominance, now found himself recalculating every assumption he had made about the small human scientists standing before him. But the Korthagi were not a species that adapted well to having their worldview challenged. Violence was their answer to uncertainty, aggression their response to fear. And despite Sarah's revelation, despite the growing realization that he might have misjudged the situation, Vrak-Th's warrior conditioning began to reassert itself. Even if what you say is true, he growled, his claws extending once more, that was your species acting as a whole. You're one small female, alone and far from your pack. Ancient victories mean nothing in personal combat. Sarah tilted her head, studying him with the clinical interest of a scientist observing a particularly interesting specimen. You know, that's another common misconception about humans. This idea that we're pack hunters who become helpless when separated from the group. She moved away from the viewing window, beginning to circle slowly around the Korthagi warrior. The movement seemed casual, almost aimless, but something about it made the hair on the necks of every mammalian species in the room stand on end. The truth is quite the opposite, she continued conversationally. Human pack hunting isn't about dependency. It's about efficiency. When we work together, we can take down prey much larger than ourselves with minimal risk and maximum resource conservation. Vrak-Th turned to keep her in sight, his predator instincts automatically responding to the circling behavior even as his conscious mind dismissed the threat she might represent. But when a human is alone, Sarah said, completing one circuit and beginning another, when a human is cut off from support and resources, when a human has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for, that's when we become truly dangerous. Kextar, who had been following the conversation with growing alarm, finally stepped forward. Sarah, I think perhaps we should continue this discussion in a more controlled environment. The laboratory has better monitoring equipment, and... Kex, do me a favor, Sarah said without taking her eyes off Rek. Access the Galactic Combat Database, and look up something for me. The Zalani scales shifted nervously, but he activated his wrist communicator and linked to the station's computer system. What should I search for? Individual combat records for humans in the Frontier Wars. The request seemed innocuous enough, but Commander Thylek-6's crystalline form immediately began cycling through rapid color changes. Dr. Chun, those records are classified at the highest levels. Even I don't have access to. Try searching under Xenobiology research exemptions, Sarah suggested helpfully. Cross-reference with behavioral analysis of human combat performance under stress. Kextar worked quietly for several moments, his four hands dancing across the holographic interface. Then he stopped, his scales going completely pale as he stared at the data streaming across his display. This can't be right, he whispered. Sarah continued her slow circuit around Vrak-Th, who had now begun to show signs of genuine unease. What does it say, Kex? The Zalani's voice was hollow with disbelief. According to these records, humans have never lost an individual combat engagement with another sentient species. Not once. In over 3 centuries of recorded conflicts. The observation deck fell silent, except for the sound of breathing from various alien respiratory systems. Even that seemed muted, as if everyone present was afraid to make too much noise. That's impossible, Vrak snarled. No species has that kind of combat record. The Korthagi are undefeated in single combat, and even we have lost engagements to superior opponents. Keep reading, Kex, Sarah encouraged. What does it say about human losses? The Zalani's scales continued to pale as he scrolled through the data. Human fatalities in individual combat. Oh, by the 7 moons. Out loud, please. Kextar's voice cracked as he read from the display. Human combat fatalities are recorded as acceptable losses in pursuit of tactical objectives. The typical ratio is 1 human casualty for every 12 to 15 enemy combatants eliminated. Vrak mandibles clicked in rapid succession, a sign of extreme agitation. Propaganda. Military records are always inflated to improve morale. These aren't military records, Kextar replied, his voice distant with shock. They're medical reports filed by neutral observers for the Galactic Health Organization. They were studying combat trauma across species to develop better treatment protocols. Sarah had stopped circling and now stood perfectly still about 3 meters from the Korthagi warrior. To most observers, she appeared completely relaxed, but there was something in her posture that suggested coiled energy, potential movement held in check by conscious will. The thing about humans, she said quietly, is that we don't really understand the concept of acceptable losses the way other species do. When we lose someone in combat, we don't just mourn them. We study the engagement. We analyze what went wrong. We figure out how to make sure it never happens again. She smiled, and the expression was serene and terrifying. And then we teach those lessons to every other human who might face similar circumstances. We share them through our military academies, our training programs, our cultural stories. Every human who dies in combat becomes a teacher for every human who fights afterward. Vrak was beginning to back away now, his instincts finally overriding his pride. You're trying to frighten me with stories, soft skin. I have killed dozens of opponents in single combat. I'm a warrior of the Korthagi. I'm sure you are, Sarah agreed readily. And I'm sure your people are formidable fighters in their own right. But you've never fought a human before, have you? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the other researchers had formed a loose circle, some recording the confrontation for later analysis, others simply too fascinated to look away. I have studied human anatomy, Vrak growled. Your bones are weak, your muscles inadequate, your reflexes slow by galactic standards. You have no natural weapons, no armor, no enhanced senses to guide you in battle. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. All true, but you're thinking about this wrong, Vrak. You're thinking like a Korthagi, like someone who was born a warrior and trained to fight from childhood. She began moving again, but this time her steps were more purposeful, more controlled. The casual scientist was disappearing, being replaced by something else entirely. Humans aren't born warriors. We're born problem solvers. We look at challenges and we ask ourselves, how can I overcome this with the tools and resources available to me? Vrak claws were now fully extended, his massive frame coiled for action, but there was uncertainty in his burning orange eyes. What tools could you possibly have that would matter against a Korthagi warrior? Well, Sarah said conversationally, let's start with the obvious ones. Environment, for instance. She gestured around them at the observation deck with its reinforced viewing windows and precisely controlled atmosphere. We're on a space station with artificial gravity and life support systems calibrated for multiple species' comfort zones. The air pressure is slightly higher than Earth normal, which means more oxygen available for rapid muscle function. The gravity is about 85% of standard, which affects trajectory calculations but improves overall mobility. Vrak eyes narrowed as he realized she wasn't just making conversation. She was analyzing combat parameters in real time. The deck plating is titanium steel composite with a coefficient of friction designed to prevent slipping during emergency maneuvers, Sarah continued. Good traction for sudden directional changes. The lighting is full spectrum but tuned toward the blue end to reduce eye strain, which means better depth perception and reaction timing. Her voice remained perfectly calm, but her movements had become more fluid, more precise. She was no longer just circling randomly. She was mapping the space, calculating angles, and distances with the unconscious efficiency of long practice. The viewing windows are transparent aluminum, virtually unbreakable under normal circumstances. But they're designed to fail safely in sections if compromised, which creates useful projectile fragments if needed. Commander Thylex 6's crystalline form had gone completely clear in distress. Dr. Chun, surely you're not suggesting that violence is necessary here. This is a research station, a place of learning and cooperation. Oh, I completely agree, Commander, Sarah replied without taking her attention off Frack. Violence should always be the last resort. But sometimes, when dealing with predatory species that only understand dominance hierarchies, a demonstration becomes necessary for the sake of future cooperation. The Korthagi warrior was beginning to understand that he had walked into something far more complex than a simple intimidation scenario. The small human scientist was systematically deconstructing his advantages while highlighting her own tactical awareness. "You think your analysis will save you when claws meet flesh?" he snarled. But his voice lacked the confident aggression it had carried earlier. "Analysis is just the first step," Sarah agreed. "The real advantage humans have in combat situations is adaptation. We're not locked into instinctive behaviors the way most predator species are. We can change tactics mid-engagement based on new information." She stopped moving and faced him directly, her dark eyes meeting his burning orange gaze without flinching. "For example, I can see from your pheromone output and posture that you're conflicted right now. Part of you wants to attack, because that's how your species resolves dominance disputes. But another part of you is starting to realize that you might have misread the threat level." Vrakth's mandibles clicked rapidly. "I fear nothing, least of all a fragile human female." "Fear and caution aren't the same thing," Sarah observed. "Fear is emotional. Caution is tactical. One clouds judgment, the other clarifies it." She tilted her head slightly, and something in her expression shifted. The warm, gentle scientist was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something patient and calculating and utterly without mercy. "The question you need to ask yourself, Vrakth, is whether you're feeling fear or caution right now. Because the answer will determine how this ends." The moment of truth had arrived with the weight of inevitability. Vrakth, warrior of the Korthagi, found himself trapped between his species' fundamental nature and a growing recognition that he had ventured into dangerous waters. Around them, the observation deck had become an impromptu arena, with researchers from a dozen species bearing witness to what could be either an educational demonstration or a bloodbath. The Korthagi warrior's internal struggle played out across his features like a storm breaking over a mountainside. His pride demanded action. His training insisted on dominance. But his survival instincts, honed by countless battles across 3 galactic quadrants, whispered warnings about the small human standing before him with such unsettling calm. "You think you can intimidate me with words and analysis," Vrakth finally growled, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. "But combat isn't about thinking. It's about action. It's about who strikes fastest and hardest." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if he had just made an excellent point in an academic discussion. "That's true for most species. The Korthagi, the Hegemony Raiders, the Stellar Hunters, you're all built for explosive combat. Maximum force applied as quickly as possible to overwhelm the opponent before they can react." She began moving again, but this time her steps were different, more purposeful, more controlled, like a predator that had finished assessing the situation and was now positioning for optimal advantage. But humans evolved differently. We weren't built for explosive combat. We were built for persistence hunting, for tracking prey across impossible distances until it collapsed from exhaustion, for outlasting opponents who were stronger, faster, and better armed than we were. Vraktich's claws scraped against the deck, plating as his hands clenched into fists. Ancient evolutionary advantages mean nothing in modern combat, don't they? Sarah's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. Kex, could you do me another favor? Access my personnel file and read out my educational background. The Zalani scales had remained pale since reading the combat statistics, and his voice trembled slightly as he accessed the requested information. Dr. Sarah Chun, Xenobiology Specialist. Doctorate from Cambridge University, Earth, with specialization in comparative neural architecture across species. Postdoctoral work at the Martian Institute for... Skip ahead to the military service record, Sarah interrupted gently. Kextar's 4 hands froze over his display. There's no military service record listed. Look under classified annexes. Cross-reference with Earth Defense Force personnel files. The silence stretched while Kextar worked through security protocols and access requests. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Captain Sarah Chun, Earth Defense Force Special Operations Division. 17 years of service. Combat deployments to, by the 7 Moons, the Outer Rim Pacification, the Hegemin Uprising, He stopped reading, his scales cycling through colors that had no names in any human language. Sarah's smile remained gentle and patient. How many successful missions, Kex? 237. Kextar's voice cracked. With a survival rate among her unit of 98.4%. The observation deck had gone completely silent. Even the background hum of the station's systems seemed muted, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Vrakth stared at the small human scientist with new eyes, his predator instincts finally registering what his conscious mind had refused to accept. This wasn't prey. This had never been prey. This was something far more dangerous. A predator disguised as prey. A killer wearing the mask of scholar. Impossible, he whispered. You're a scientist. You study neural patterns and behavioral matrices. You drink coffee and worry about data analysis. I'm a scientist, Sarah agreed readily. I've been studying behavioral patterns for the last 18 months, documenting aggression responses and dominance displays across multiple species. It's fascinating work, really. You learn so much about what drives different beings to violence. She stopped moving and stood perfectly still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture seemingly casual. But something about the way she held herself suggested coiled potential, like a spring compressed to its breaking point and held in place by nothing but wool. But before I was a scientist, I was something else. For 17 years, I was the thing that human mothers told their children about in bedtime stories. The monster under the bed, the shadow in the closet, the reason why even the worst nightmares eventually learned to fear the dark. Vraktich's orange eyes had dimmed to a dull amber, and his massive frame seemed to shrink slightly as understanding finally penetrated his warrior's pride. You were a killer. I was a soldier, Sarah corrected gently. There's a difference. Killers act from passion, from emotion, from personal desire. Soldiers act from duty, from necessity, from the understanding that sometimes violence is the only language that certain beings understand. The distinction was lost on no one present. A killer might hesitate, might be reasoned with, might be swayed by emotion or circumstance. A soldier, a true soldier who had spent 17 years perfecting the art of control violence, was something else entirely. And right now, Sarah continued, her voice carrying the same gentle tone she had used throughout their conversation, you're forcing me to remember those lessons, to access skills and knowledge that I've spent 18 months trying to forget. Commander Thylex 6's crystalline form flickered through rapid color changes as she struggled to process what she was witnessing. Dr. Chun, surely this situation doesn't require. That is to say, perhaps we could find a peaceful resolution. I hope so, Commander, Sarah replied without taking her eyes off Vrek. I genuinely hope so, because the alternative isn't something anyone in this room wants to see. The threat wasn't stated directly, but it hung in the air like ozone before a lightning strike. Around them, the assembled researchers found themselves caught between fascination and terror, unable to look away from what was unfolding, but increasingly aware that they might be witnessing something that would haunt their dreams for years to come. Vrak-TH's warrior training warred with his survival instincts, producing a paralysis that was as foreign to his nature as compassion or mercy. The Korth-Agi were bred for action, for decisive violence that resolved conflicts through superior force. But how could he apply that programming against an opponent who might be more dangerous than he was? You're bluffing, he finally snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. No human could stand against a Korth-Agi warrior in single combat. Our physical advantages are too significant. Physical advantages, Sarah mused, tilting her head as if considering the point. Let's examine those for a moment. You're about 40% larger than me, with natural weapons, better reflexes, and an exoskeleton that can turn aside most conventional attacks. She nodded acknowledgement of his superior capabilities, but something in her expression suggested these were simply factors to be incorporated into her calculations rather than insurmountable obstacles. But you're also operating in an environment that wasn't designed for your species' optimal performance. The atmospheric mix is wrong for Korth-Agi physiology, which means your stamina will degrade faster than normal. The gravity is lighter than your homeworld standard, which throws off your balance and strike timing. Vrak-TH's eyes narrowed as he realized she was analyzing him the way a scientist might study a laboratory specimen. More importantly, you're fighting according to your instincts, which are predictable. Korth-Agi combat doctrine emphasizes overwhelming force applied through direct assault. You'll try to close distance quickly, pin me with your superior reach, and finish the engagement with claw strikes to vital areas. The accuracy of her assessment was unnerving. She was describing Korth-Agi battle tactics with the precision of someone who had studied them extensively, possibly through direct experience with previous opponents. Knowing what you'll do doesn't help you stop me from doing it, Vrak-TH growled, but even he could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Doesn't it? Sarah's smile became predatory, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Vrak-TH felt genuine fear. Not the healthy caution that kept warriors alive, but the bone-deep terror of prey animals who suddenly realized they were being hunted. The thing about human combat doctrine, she said conversationally, is that we've never been able to rely on superior physical attributes. We've always been the smaller, weaker species. So we developed different advantages. She shifted her weight slightly, and Vrak-TH found his predator instincts screaming warnings about the subtle change in her posture. We learned to use our opponent's strength against them, to turn their advantages into disadvantages, to make them defeat themselves through their own aggressive instincts. The truth of what was happening finally penetrated Vrak-TH's warrior mindset with the force of a revelation. He wasn't engaged in a simple dominance display with a weaker opponent. He was being maneuvered, manipulated, led step by step into a trap that he had helped to construct through his own arrogance and aggression. You planned this, he whispered, the words coming out like an accusation and a prayer combined. I hoped it wouldn't be necessary, Sarah replied honestly. But, yes, from the moment you walked onto this observation deck, I've been preparing for this possibility. Analyzing your behavioral patterns, assessing your capabilities, planning contingencies for various scenarios. She took a single step forward, and Vrak-TH found himself taking an involuntary step backward. Because that's what humans do, Vrak-TH. We prepare, we plan, we consider every possible outcome, and develop strategies for dealing with all of them. And when someone forces us into a corner, when someone threatens our safety or the safety of those under our protection, another step forward, another step back, we become the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. A human being with nothing left to lose and 17 years of experience in making problems disappear. The moment had come. The choice that would determine how this confrontation ended was no longer in Sarah's hands. It was in Vraktiech's, and they both knew it. The question hanging in air between them was simple. Would the Korthagi warrior's pride prove stronger than his survival instincts? The answer would determine whether the observation deck witnessed an educational demonstration about the dangers of underestimating humans, or whether it became the site of the galaxy's first documented case of a human xenobiologist reverting to her previous occupation as a professional killer. The confrontation reached its crescendo in the space between heartbeats. Vraktiech, warrior of the Korthagi, found himself faced with a choice that would define not only his own fate, but potentially alter the galaxy's understanding of human nature. The accumulated weight of his species' pride, his personal honor, and his growing terror created a perfect storm of contradictory impulses. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the observation deck existed in a bubble of absolute silence. Even the ambient sounds of the station seemed to fade as every being present held their breath, waiting to see which force would prove stronger. Wisdom or pride, caution or tradition, survival instinct or warrior conditioning. Then, like a dam breaking under impossible pressure, Vraktiech's nature reasserted itself with explosive violence. "I am Korthagi," he roared, launching himself forward with all the fury and desperation of a cornered predator. His four arms spread wide to prevent escape, his claws gleaming like obsidian razors, his massive frame moving with the terrible grace of a creature born for battle. Sarah Chun, xenobiologist, scholar, and former captain of Earth Defense Force Special Operations, had been waiting for this moment with the patience of a professional who understood the inevitability of certain outcomes. Time seemed to slow as Vraktiech's charge began. Sarah's enhanced reflexes, the product of years of neural conditioning and combat stimulant exposure, allowed her to perceive the attack in perfect clarity. She saw the micro-adjustments in his approach vector, the slight overextension caused by the lower gravity, the way his aggressive mindset made him commit fully to the assault without considering defensive positions. To the observers on the deck, what happened next appeared almost anticlimactic. The massive Korthagi warrior lunged forward with devastating force, and the small human scientist simply wasn't there anymore. Sarah's movement was so fluid, so economical, that several witnesses later claimed she had simply vanished and reappeared in a different position. In reality, she had executed a textbook evasion maneuver, stepping slightly to her left while rotating her torso to let Vraktiech's outstretched claws whistle harmlessly past her face. But evasion was only the first part of the equation. As Vraktiech's momentum carried him past her position, Sarah's right hand moved with surgical precision. Her fingers, seemingly delicate compared to the warrior's claws, found the exact spot where his exoskeleton plates met at the base of his neck. A point that Korthagi anatomy texts listed as a minor vulnerability, barely worth noting in academic discussions. Those texts hadn't been written by humans. Sarah's strike wasn't the wild swing of an amateur or the desperate flailing of prey fighting for survival. It was the product of 17 years of studying alien anatomies, of learning exactly where to place force for maximum effect, of understanding that lethality wasn't about strength but about precision. Her fingertips found a neural cluster that controlled Vraktiech's motor functions, the biological equivalent of a system shutdown switch that evolution had hidden behind layers of protective plating. A human fist would have been turned aside by the armor. A human punch, no matter how powerful, would have been absorbed by the Korthagi's superior mass and conditioning. But Sarah didn't punch. She struck with fingers hardened by years of martial training, driving them into the vulnerable gap with the force of her entire body behind them. The impact lasted perhaps a tenth of a second, but it was enough to disrupt the electrical signals that kept Vraktiech's massive frame functional. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Vraktiech's roar of fury cut off abruptly as his nervous system went haywire. His four arms, which had been reaching for Sarah with lethal intent, suddenly lost all coordination. His legs, powerful enough to crush steel plating, folded beneath him like those of a newborn learning to walk. His massive frame, built to intimidate and dominate, crashed to the deck with a sound like a falling building. The warrior's orange eyes, which had burned with predatory fire moments before, rolled back in his skull as his consciousness flickered like a damaged circuit. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't functional either. He was exactly what Sarah had intended: neutralized. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds. In the aftermath, the observation deck existed in a state of shock so profound that it seemed to bend reality around itself. Researchers who had dedicated their lives to understanding behavior patterns found themselves witnessing something that challenged every assumption they had made about human capabilities. Kextar, whose scales had been cycling through fear patterns for the past hour, finally found his voice. Is he alive? Sarah knelt beside the fallen Korthagi, her movements once again those of a concerned scientist rather than a trained killer. She checked his pulse, examined his breathing, tested his reflexes with the clinical efficiency of someone conducting a routine medical evaluation. He's fine, she announced, standing up and brushing dust from her hands. Neural disruption, not permanent damage. He'll be unconscious for about 20 minutes, disoriented for another hour after that, but no lasting effects. Commander Thylax-6's crystalline form had gone completely transparent in shock. What exactly did you do? Applied precise force to a vulnerable nerve cluster, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. The Korthagi exoskeleton is impressive, but evolution doesn't account for opponents who study anatomy as intensively as humans do. Every species has weaknesses. You just need to know where to look. She turned to address the assembled researchers, and the transformation was remarkable. The deadly predator who had dismantled a Korthagi warrior in seconds had disappeared, replaced once again by the gentle, scholarly Dr. Chen they all knew. This is actually an excellent teaching opportunity, she said, settling back into her academic persona as easily as putting on a familiar coat. Vrak-TH's approach was tactically sound by Korthagi standards, but it relied on assumptions about human behavior that proved to be incorrect. Several of the observers were recording everything, their scientific minds already processing the implications of what they had witnessed. Others simply stared, trying to reconcile the mild-mannered xenobiologist with the efficient violence they had just seen. The key lesson here, Sarah continued, is that every species develops combat strategies based on their own evolutionary pressures and environmental challenges. The Korthagi evolved to fight other Korthagi or species with similar attributes. Their tactics work beautifully against opponents who respond predictably to aggressive displays. She gestured down at the unconscious warrior with the casual air of someone discussing an interesting research specimen. But humans evolved to fight everything. We've never had the luxury of assuming our opponents would behave according to familiar patterns. We learned to adapt, to study, to find weaknesses that other species couldn't even perceive. Kextar was slowly regaining some color in his scales, but his voice still trembled. Sarah, that was incredible, but also terrifying. I had no idea you were capable of violence. Sarah supplied gently. Most people don't. That's rather the point. One of humanity's greatest advantages is that we don't look particularly dangerous until the moment we need to be. She moved to the observation window and gazed out at the swirling storms of the gas giant below, her expression thoughtful and slightly melancholy. The truth is, I became a xenobiologist because I was tired of being what the galaxy needed me to be during the wars. I wanted to understand other species, not fight them. I wanted to build bridges, not burn them down. Commander Thylax-6 had regained enough composure to speak, though her crystalline form continued to flicker with residual shock patterns. But you were prepared to use your military skills when challenged. Sarah turned from the window, and her smile was both sad and resigned. I'll always be prepared, Commander. That's the burden every human soldier carries. We can choose not to fight, but we can never choose to forget how. She looked down at Vrak-TH, who was beginning to show signs of stirring consciousness. The galaxy sees human restraint as weakness because most species equate the ability to cause harm with a willingness to cause harm. But for humans, the greatest strength is knowing that you could destroy something and choosing not to, choosing to find another way. As if summoned by her words, Vraktich's orange eyes flickered open, unfocused and confused. He tried to rise, failed, and managed only to prop himself up on one elbow as his motor functions slowly came back online. What happened? He mumbled, his voice slurred with disorientation. Sarah knelt beside him again, her manner gentle and concerned. You fell, Vraktich. Hit your head on the deck plating. Here, let me help you up. She offered him her hand, the same hand that had rendered him unconscious moments before, and, after a moment's hesitation, the confused warrior accepted her assistance. I don't remember falling, he said, allowing her to help him to a sitting position. We were talking, and then head injuries can cause temporary memory loss, Sarah explained with perfect medical authority. Nothing to worry about. Your motor functions are coming back normally, and I don't see any signs of serious trauma. The assembled researchers watched in fascination as the human xenobiologist tended to the warrior who had threatened her with violence just minutes earlier. There was no trace of anger in her demeanor, no hint of vindictiveness or triumph. She was simply helping an injured being, as if their confrontation had never happened. Vraktiach struggled to his feet with Sarah's assistance, his massive frame still unsteady but functional. As his consciousness cleared, fragments of memory began to return. The challenge, the circling, the growing sense of unease, and then, "You," he said suddenly, his orange eyes focusing on Sarah with new understanding. "You did something to me." Sarah's expression remained perfectly neutral. "I helped you to your feet after you fell. That's what colleagues do for each other." But Vraktiach was a warrior, even if he was a confused one. His instincts told him that something significant had happened, even if his conscious mind couldn't quite piece together the details. "I challenged you," he said slowly, the memories coming back in fragments. "I was going to prove that humans were weak." "And what did you learn?" Sarah asked gently. The Korthagi warrior stared at her for a long moment, his predator instincts finally providing him with a clarity that his conscious mind had missed. He understood now what had happened, even if he couldn't remember the specifics. He had threatened a human, and the human had responded with exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize the threat without causing permanent harm. No more, no less. Perfectly calibrated, professionally executed. "I learned," he said quietly, "that humans are the most dangerous predators in the galaxy." Sarah shook her head gently. "No, Vrakti, you learned that humans are the most dangerous protectors in the galaxy. There's a difference." She helped him steady himself against a nearby support pillar, then stepped back with a satisfied air of someone whose lesson had been successfully delivered. "We don't fight because we enjoy it. We fight because sometimes it's necessary to protect the things we value. And when we do fight, we fight to win quickly, efficiently, and with as little unnecessary damage as possible." Vraktiach nodded slowly, his warrior's pride strangely intact despite his defeat. Perhaps because he was beginning to understand that he hadn't been defeated by superior aggression or dominance, but by superior technique and restraint. "I apologize for my behavior," he said formally. "I misjudged your species, and you in particular." "No offense taken," Sarah replied with genuine warmth. "Understanding between species takes time. That's why we're all here, after all, to learn from each other." As the tension finally began to dissipate from the observation deck, researchers slowly returned to their conversations and studies. The confrontation was over, but its implications would be discussed and analyzed for years to come. Commander Thylex 6 approached Sarah as the crowd dispersed, her crystalline form still flickering with residual amazement. "Dr. Chun," she said quietly, "that was perhaps the most educational demonstration I've witnessed in 40 years of interspecies relations." Sarah smiled, already turning her attention back to the neural mapping data that had brought her to the observation deck in the first place. Sometimes, she said, the best way to teach someone about human nature is to show them exactly why they should be grateful we prefer to use words. And with that, Dr. Sarah Chun, xenobiologist and former instrument of humanity's darker necessities, returned to her research, leaving behind a room full of beings who would never again mistake human gentleness for human weakness. In the end, that was perhaps the most human thing of all, to demonstrate overwhelming capability and then immediately return to the patient work of building understanding between the stars.